All right, so good morning. So as they said, I normally study the role of secondary metabolites and how they shape plant, fungal, and microbial interactions. But today I'll be talking to you about something entirely different. So for the last 2 years, I've been spending a chunk of my Tuesday evenings and a good fair chunk of my weekends talking about unconscious bias, what it is, why it matters for STEM, and most importantly, what we can actually do about it. And so I know a bunch about these social biases. When they asked me to give the talk, I was planning to relate some of that unconscious psychology to hierarchies in science. So how certain fields like ecology and mycology are sort of undervalued relative to other fields. And so I hopped on Web of Science and I looked into the literature and I found nothing. And so I emailed a bunch of social scientists and psychologists to see if maybe I was using the wrong search terms or something. And they got back to me and they said nothing. But luckily, what happened is I did pique the interest of one social scientist who's now going to interview me next week to talk about, does unconscious bias influence how we think about different sciences and the hierarchies that we have? And so if you have thoughts on that during the break, I'm really excited to talk about it. So instead, to sort of save you from a bunch of hand-wavy speculation about ideas there's no empirical evidence behind, today instead I want to focus on what I do know a lot about and what there is evidence on unconscious bias. And I promise I will link it to genomics and fungi right at the end. So I apologize for the bait and switch, but I did make slides on cognitive biases and how they might relate to fungi, and you can download those from my blog. And there's also a bunch of stuff about science writing and other things there that might be of interest. And I'll start today by giving you a little conceptual background, and then I'll show you some peer-reviewed studies on why unconscious bias matters specifically in STEM, and then what we can do about it. Okay, so all our lives we are exposed to negative stereotypes, these widely held but fixed and oversimplified ideas of a particular person or type or thing. And such stereotypes are reinforced by television, movies, radio, the books we read, countless sources on the internet, and by the people around us. And because of this social programming, even really well-meaning, intelligent folks like us can unconsciously act with unconscious bias. And we define bias as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. And just a quick note that in the literature, people use implicit bias and unconscious bias interchangeably, and I might do that here as well. And what's really insidious about unconscious bias is that, like I said, we, us, myself included, can harbor these unconscious biases even when we consciously believe that sexism or racism or whatever is wrong. And these biases come from stereotypes. So I want to just point out a couple that I'll build on later. So such as, historically, men have worked while women have stayed home with the children. Women can either be beautiful or intelligent, but not both. Men are better at spatial reasoning. Here in the US, African Americans are commonly portrayed as criminals. And what's extra important is that, what's also important at least, is that positive stereotypes can be just as hurtful, like saying that Asian people are all good at math. And our brains are these fantastic things, right? They're like programmable machines. And sometimes bias comes not from stereotypes themselves, but just associations of patterns that we notice unconsciously, like that most scientists are men and not women, or that custodians are often racial minorities. And before stereotypes even lead to bias, there's a lot of data showing that stereotypes by themselves are damaging. So being stereotyped has been found to lead to short-term aggression, inability to focus, resulting in decreased performance and overeating. People who regularly report feeling that they've been judged by negative stereotypes are more likely to have hypertension, to be depressed, and to rate their own overall health more poorly. And so being at the receiving end of positive bias hurts too. So in one study, implying someone is likely good at math because they are Asian can make the victim dislike the speaker and invokes those feelings of anger just like a negative stereotype. So when these stereotypes can lead to unconscious bias about who can thrive in science and tech, this leads to barriers to entering STEM fields, like girls being told that they're all bad at math. It also creates barriers to rising in STEM, like people of color being judged more harshly during interviews. And even when you're successful, this sort of harassing or unsupportive work environment is a really common reason that people leave STEM. And then together, these forces reinforce the pre-existing stereotypes, creating what we've dubbed the positive feedback loop of negative stereotypes. Okay, so if the topic of unconscious bias has only been on the edge of your radar, you might not think it's a huge deal. But allow me to summarize a few decades worth of research with this iconic 2009 paper titled, "The Existence of Implicit Bias is Beyond Reasonable Doubt, a Refutation of Ideological and Methodological Objections, an Executive Summary of 10 Studies that No Manager Should Ignore." And so as I started reading all this a few years ago, I confess I was honestly surprised, and I didn't know that sort of like the so-called debate on climate change, among social scientists, this is a non-issue. Like the role of bias in holding back white women, people of color, queer folks, and more is a non-issue. Like unconscious bias is real, and it is impacting diversity. So this is an example from business, but I'll run through a few STEM-specific publications now, just to sort of drive that point home. Okay, so I know we have an international audience here, so here's a paper from Europe showing that both explicit or conscious and implicit or unconscious bias, these unconscious math language stereotypes influence whether teachers recommend a student for math and science versus a language-oriented school. From the US, this study, Altering Resume Names, shows how professors respond to emails from fictional applicants more often when the name is perceived as that of the white male compared to white females or black people, Hispanic people, Indian people, or Chinese people. There's a lot of evidence showing that there's unconscious bias about who gets published in peer-reviewed papers. So this study from the Journal of Behavioral Ecology showed that the proportion of women published increased after they made the system double-blind, so like when reviewers can't see who the authors are. And they contrasted that with a similar journal that stayed single-blind but didn't experience the same increase in women. And if you don't like that study, here's another one from Hungary that examines the role of reciprocity. So papers, like actual already published papers with female authors, receive more negative reviews than papers with all male authors. But female reviewers give more negative reviews than male reviews. And with respect to nationality, Western reviewers give disproportionately more recommendations for major revisions, while non-Western reviewers tended to receive more outright rejections. And like, we're not just discriminating against women and minorities, but also giving an unfair advantage to folks from more prestigious labs. And I say that as someone from a prestigious lab that could really benefit from this, but in this experimental study, a fabricated paper with fatal flaws was accepted more often when prestigious author names were visible than when no names or less prestigious names were there. Getting jobs. So here's one of many double-blind experiments finding that potential employers rate male students as more hireable than female students. And this sort of study, like the gold standard where people don't know they're in the study and they've been sent resumes with altered names, always finds this sort of pattern that women get discriminated against. The only study that finds that sometimes there's a bias for women are the types of studies where someone like goes into a lab and they like are given 2 different resumes and then they're told like pick one, which one is better. And sometimes that sort of study will find a preference for women, and I think what it's really showing is that consciously we don't want to be discriminating, right? Or at least we don't want to be seen discriminating, but unconsciously it happens. And there's enough literature on this to really start illuminating like the nuances of the bias too, and this is like just in STEM still, right? So this is showing that so-called like high-achieving male faculty over the course of their career employ significantly fewer women than less achieving male scientists. And another lab study found that both men and women are more likely to consider a male for a job even when the females outperform the males at a math assessment. So if the potential employees are allowed to write about themselves, it can undo some of the effect of that bias, but the average man is apparently more likely to over-exaggerate his qualities, so it's sort of difficult. This is another resume study from the UK showing that white folks show unconscious racial bias in who they'd hire for an academic post, but no bias for the administrative post. There it is there. Bias against mothers. So this is a 2007 paper in the American Journal of Sociology showing a specific bias against women with children. And the social scientists really like tables, so we formatted it into a bar chart here. But what you see is that otherwise identical resumes that listed parent-teacher-student activities or sort of like indicating parenthood, the ones that were from moms received significantly fewer callbacks than women with no hint of being a mother. And the fathers, however, receive what's called the fatherhood premium. So they get a bonus. They get more callbacks than the moms do. And the same sort of trend of motherhood penalty and fatherhood premium has been found in China and other countries as well. There's bias against money. So the first study was in the UK and found the differences in grant amounts and sizes between men and women. So there are these differences among fields, though, which I think is really interesting. And there's actually like a little gender difference in the studies of neurological infections and STDs, which probably relates back to stereotypes in some way that I don't quite follow, but I do think it's kind of interesting. And then here in the US, the NIH has posted numbers about their gender balance over the last 15 years or so. And on the left, you see, the left side of the circles, you see the absolute number of grants awarded, men in yellow, women in red. And on the right, we see the persistent gap in the size of awards over time. And then on the bottom, we see the wage gap in 3 different STEM fields, which averages to 18%. So most of the research on bias examines gender bias, I think simply because women are the largest demographic of people that get biased against. But there's also a fair number of studies on that intersection between gender and race, or the specific issues that women of color experience in STEM. So I really recommend these reviews called Double Jeopardy. And just some highlights, nearly 60% of Latinas note backlash for expressing anger, and Black women are allowed a little bit more leeway than other women to behave in dominant ways as long as they aren't seen as angry Black women. Okay, so to tie this all together with a really depressing bow, a small handful of studies examine who believes the results of these sorts of studies I was just discussing. And it's unsurprising to me, at least, that the folks that are most frequently at the receiving end of the bias are those that are most likely to accept such findings as true, much like how white women and racial minorities are most likely to vote for a double-blind peer review system. So in this paper, for example, researchers examined public comments in response to an article finding evidence of gender bias against women, and men were more likely than women to post negative responses to such articles, and women were more likely to post positive responses. Okay, so that's that for the bad news. So on a more positive note, the primary literature also shows that there are measures that we can take that are empirically shown to reliably reduce bias and thereby increase diversity in STEM. But that useful information is often lost among a sea of people sort of arguing about whether or not unconscious bias really matters. So enter the Unconscious Bias Project. So right now we're a group of about 12 STEM people, plus our awesome graphic design artist and our resident cartoonist. And our main goal is to create a website and these workshops that outline the following. So one, just promote that mountain of peer-reviewed evidence that doesn't make it out into the public, and show how bias affects all these different groups, not just women, but people of color, people that are queer, etc. And we're translating from the primary lit in what I hope to be relatively jargon-free language so that anybody can understand it. And we're taking advantage of that in-group, out-group bias, in that we're mostly STEM people, so we have a bit more social clout than the social scientists would have if they came in and did the same thing. We're making awareness, we have an awareness campaign, so our cartoonist draws these little vignettes of different ways that bias can manifest. And so this is showing an example of the statistic that over 50% of women of color in STEM have been mistaken for custodial or administrative staff. So it happens all the time. And our third goal is to provide scientifically proven tips to reduce our personal unconscious biases and tips to counter its effects. So I see 3 sorts of approaches to bias. We can enact institutional policy changes to limit the effects of bias, but meanwhile, we still have to talk to people, so it's important that we also work to reduce our own unconscious biases. And thirdly, we can speak up when other people speak and act in unconsciously biased ways. And this is important both to help people become aware of their biases, because we're not bad people, right? We just don't know that we're doing it. And so we want to be aware so that we're not negatively impacting others. And it's also important to speak up because that can help undo some of those negative, immediate effects that I mentioned, like anger and the inability to focus. Okay, so I'll just start with policy changes. So one of the easiest and quickest ways to keep ourselves from accidentally judging people based off identities like race or gender is to just remove those identities from our assessment with blinding. And so, for example, we recently launched a petition on Canvas. So this is something that a lot of the UC schools use to enter grades and to grade things. And there's no way to sort by student number. You have to go by name. And so if someone submits something, you already see their name when you go to grade it. And so you can sign this petition too, and it'll help to eliminate some of that. And really, whenever you can blind something, just blind it, because there's a lot of data on this, and it really will increase the chances of people getting a fair assessment. Okay, so meanwhile, we can't enact policy for everything. At some point, you're gonna have to talk to people, so it's important that we do some grunt work to reduce our own biases too. But I wanted to find peer-reviewed, evidence-based trainings that we can feel good about. So for example, who in the audience has gone to a training, a diversity training that they liked, that they thought was good? Yeah, okay. And who's been to one that was a total waste of time? Yeah, right? Okay, so it turns out there's actually a fair bit of evidence that a bad training can not only not reduce your unconscious bias, but actually leave you with more bias, more hostile attitudes towards people, because it'll just point out all these differences between us without actually giving us the mental exercises to think about it differently. And so we found this paper, for example. This is Devine et al. In 2012, in a controlled lab setting, they found that this training worked to reduce implicit bias, as measured by this online test and some other metrics, for at least 3 months. And so I contacted them, and they sent me all the materials, and I converted everything to PowerPoint, and I've given the workshop both on campus and elsewhere. And attendees just have to bring a laptop and 90 minutes, it's not an all-day thing, it's actually pretty brief, and afterward they are statistically likely to have less bias. So it's pretty great. And one of the reasons it seems to be so effective is that attendees leave with an increased concern about unconscious bias, which encourages them to continue applying the mental exercises that they learned in the workshop, thus continually reducing bias. And I'm happy to give our modified version, or you can contact the folks at Madison, Wisconsin, and they will give it to you for a fee too. They're really nice. Okay, so I'd like to distill their entire paper into 2 slides now. So a paper that I read as early as 1994 pinpointed that there are certain prerequisites necessary to reliably reduce bias. And these are as follows. 1, you have to be motivated. If you don't care, you're not going to reduce bias. 2, you have to become aware of your bias and why it exists. And so, for example, the workshop starts with people taking this online test called the implicit association test. It measures these microsecond differences in how quickly we associate certain terms with certain different groups of people. And it's not a perfect assessment, but I think that it really drives home the idea that bias comes from these automatic associations that our mind builds, and it can be in direct opposition to our conscious thought. Okay, so you get that. And then you just learn to detect the subtle influence of stereotypes, just pay attention to stereotypes, and learn and practice these strategies that help reduce automatic bias. Okay, what are the strategies? I will tell you. But first, it's important to point out that none of these strategies were new to this paper. They were all independently found to be useful in previous studies, and they just combined them all for this workshop. So the first is stereotype replacement. So you can use this when you notice yourself having a stereotypical thought, or when you see a stereotype portrayed on TV or elsewhere. You can use counter-stereotypic examples. There's actually an entire paper on what's called the Obama effect, which is just using Obama as a counter-stereotypic example when people present racial bias. It's pretty great. Individuating, so this just means that when you notice someone and you start to lump them into some category, get to know them instead. Ideally get to talk with them, but you can also just notice unique features on them, like their glasses or their shoes or whatever. 4 is perspective taking. This is why reading fiction is so important. It really does help to put yourself in their shoes. And then the last one is, I think, the funnest one, increasing opportunities for contact. And this can be both making friends from these different groups, or reading books about them, or watching movies, etc. And that's essentially it. So the workshop makes you practice a bit more introspection and thinking, what the social scientists call system 2 processing. But that's really the gist of the workshop. And if we can assemble genomes, we can practice these strategies, right? Okay. So meanwhile, not everyone is probably as woke as we are now. And so the third approach to address bias is to learn how to speak up when others act with unconscious bias. And our bystander intervention and awareness workshop starts by discussing the role of negative stereotypes and giving a bunch of examples. And then we outline a number of different types of hurtful scenarios, like the one in this cartoon, most of which are drawn from examples that we get from STEM members at Cal and beyond. So feel free to share your stories with me, and we might make them into a cartoon. We provide tips for addressing different manifestations of bias, depending on, where are you, what's your personality like, how much power does this person have over you, that sort of thing. So we give a range of different responses, because there's no right answer to this sort of thing, right? It's going to be super context dependent. But you can download one of the versions of this on our website, and please share it. It's really useful. We get asked to give it all the time. And I'll give you just 3 slides now as a taste. Okay. So if unconscious bias is a really common occurrence in your environment, consider using the buddy system. So to use this buddy system, simply find a buddy. Maybe you have a secret handshake or a decoder ring or whatever it is, just so that you know that you're buddies. And you and your buddy can remind each other before meetings or certain events to be on the lookout for bias. And a bias buddy is strongest when you're different races or genders or religion, etc. And bias buddy can do a lot of things. So, for example, you can, I said those things. Okay, so you can call out interruptions, oh no, I want to hear what Sarah has to say. You can give credit where credit is due, hey, Julio just said that 15 minutes ago. You can provide emotional support, she was a real jerk to you in there. And it doesn't even have to be beforehand, afterwards you can go up to someone and tell them that what they experienced was definitely crappy, like what that person did was not cool. And that can be especially useful with someone that has a disability when you're not sure like exactly how the disability might limit them and you don't want to seem patronizing. Just go up to them afterwards and say like, what would you have liked me to do? And then you can be there for them next time. So what can you say? So this is one of our most popular cartoons, and there's some female biologists reviewing some sort of flow chart, maybe it's the JGI pipeline, and in the background, one guy says to another, oh, she's really smart, but I wish she weren't so bossy. And so guy number 2 has a lot of different ways that he could respond, right? So he could name the problem, he could label it like, ouch, that's reinforcing a hurtful stereotype that women can't be leaders. He could get salty, the guy 1 said that she's really bossy. Guy 2 could say, well, you're really dense, and I wish you weren't so oppressive. Or, maybe make him think in a more gentler way, like, how come you never call guys bossy? And there's statistics on this that women get called bossy significantly more than men, right? On average. Or you could redirect it in a more positive way, say like, no, she's not bossy, she's a leader. And so remember that you don't have to do all the work. It can be really hard to come up with a clever response like that on the fly. And so instead, you could just say something like, ouch, to acknowledge that somebody just said something kind of problematic, that maybe you don't have time to really unpack what was wrong with it, or to totally derail a conversation. Or you can say like, oh, there was something kind of icky about what you just said, but you can't quite put your finger on why. Or you can just transfer the mental work to the offender by asking them to explain themselves. And so as I mentioned, that making them think through why that might be problematic is a statistically effective way of getting them to think about why bias can hurt people. And that works especially well with off-color jokes, which often reinforce negative stereotypes. Okay, so in the 10 seconds I have remaining, I want to bring this back around to genomics, and I hope that I've made a compelling case that unconscious bias is worth talking about because it negatively impacts people in an unfair way. But I'm also happy to report that there's a fair bit of evidence at this point that teams that are doing innovative work, like genomics, are, like energy and genomics, are more productive when the teams are more diverse. And I'll give a few examples relating to gender. So business seems to have caught on to this first, and they find that having more female representation in top management teams leads to higher performance, as long as the methods are innovation-focused. And that part's key, but we don't have to worry about that. Genomics is very innovative. And another paper confirmed that experimentally, the so-called general intelligence of a group is very much proportional to the number of females in the group. And the authors attribute that to what's called social sensitivity, in that women are raised more than men on average to be sort of aware of social issues and emotions and things like that. But much like spatial reasoning, that difference in spatial reasoning ability between men and women has been closing for decades, right? It's not that men are inherently better at spatial reasoning, and I don't think that women are inherently better at emotional intelligence. It's just that we get trained in different ways so that people end up with different skill sets. So what I hope is that in a few generations, all the genders are socialized a little bit more evenly, both to help women and queer folks reach parity, but also for the sake of men's mental health and happiness. Okay. Lastly, this paper showed a few different things related to collaboration and authorship, but I want to draw attention to this last line at the bottom, finding evidence for gender segregation, quote, in particular in genomics where we find female faculty to be clearly underrepresented. And so we have some serious work ahead of us in genomics, but we know how to fix it now. 10 years ago, there wasn't enough data on this, but we have the data now, so we can fix it. And it's work that will not only make things more fair in genomics, but will make it a more productive field. Okay, so can awareness of unconscious bias help change perception about fungi? Time will tell, but I certainly don't see how working to fix our own unconscious biases and make ourselves more objective could possibly hurt. And I hope that once we have a better handle on unconscious social biases as a community, we can start addressing the possible role of bias and why fungi don't get the attention that they deserve. So, in conclusion, stereotypes lead to bias, and we all have implicit bias, right? Not because we're all secretly evil supervillains, but just because we're human and we live in a world where our brain gets programmed by things. Unconscious bias is a pronounced force in STEM, but we can take intelligent steps to reduce our biases and their impacts. You can read more on our website, unconsciousbiasproject.org, or contact me about arranging a workshop for your group. We do webinars too. So thank you to our initial funding support from Sinberg. I encourage you to follow us on social media for more tips, news, and events. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
That was really great. Oh, we got a question back here.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I don't know. I try to organize my thoughts here.
It's okay. Yeah, it's sort of heavy for 9 a.m.
Yeah, and I'm just not comfortable talking in front of so many people.
Okay.
No, like I occasionally look at pictures of baby animals, and I found baby red pandas to be somewhat off-putting, and then it wasn't until weeks later I realized it's because their facial morphology reminded me of that of people with Down syndrome, which is a disturbing realization. But one of the reasons I find this topic so compelling is that I consider myself to be relatively asocial, and I think a fairly significant fraction of the population is asocial, though given the givens of that, we tend not to be aware of us, and possibly the greater society isn't necessarily aware of us. And at least partly due to that and due to the various other factors in my life, it took me 17 years to finish a bachelor's degree in 5 institutions.
But you finished it, right?
Thanks to my wife, yes.
Good job.
But something I see in the social sciences, obviously, I think a lot of social scientist researchers are temperamentally unaware that they are biased towards seeing people as social. And I think it's incredibly important, especially when you're studying unconscious bias, to be aware that there are people who are far less social than what you may expect as a socially oriented person.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that, like, not only do we sort of have a bias against, like as you said, asocial people, but there's a certain, like, positive bias for extroverts specifically. You know, the people that really like to talk with other people and get energy from talking with other people, like myself. I'm definitely an emotional leech in that way. But yeah, like, I think that no one's immune to these biases, right? And even some of the people that talk about, that have developed, you know, the implicit association test and the like, say that, you know, they found that they had biases, you know, not just through that test, but through other things. Yeah, and I'm really hoping that we can raise awareness about it, as you said, just to make it fair for everybody, because everybody deserves a chance, like, regardless of what their, you know, what their identities are. Yeah.
So I have a question. You said that, you know, you kind of have, as many of us do, have this hope that in another generation, you know, everyone will be less biased. Is there statistical peer-reviewed evidence that it is getting better on its own?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a good question. Whether or not it's getting better on its own, I think that there's definitely data showing that, for example, the proportion of women in, like, certain fields has increased, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the bias within those fields has decreased. So, like, just having more people in that position isn't enough. But as we sort of made the shift from, like, these sort of hand-wavy trainings that, you know, meant really well but weren't really, like, empirically shown to be effective, to really, like, knowing what sorts of things work, I think that that's encouraging in terms of, like, making progress. And, you know, and, like, this is really big in tech, right? And so, like, I could make so much money if I just gave these trainings to, like, Microsoft. It's kind of amazing, like, how much money they're willing to spend because they know that it really does have this measurable impact on their productivity to not be accidentally hurting each other all the time, right? And so I think that there's enough, like, financial motivation that I think that will help a lot.
But
yeah.
Generationally, is there an age impact on whether you're more biased or not?
Yeah, I mean, we get more bias as we get older, on average, yes. But there are some things, so, like, in grading, for example, as people get older, they actually get, like, less biased in grading. So, like, that's one field where it's actually, like, it's better for an undergrad to have the professor grade their things than the GSI or the teaching assistant. So it's really context dependent is what I'm learning. Yeah.
All right,
I have one question. So I have more question on encoded bias, not unconscious bias, like for machine learning or other algorithms which may have a preference to do racial profiling or something that where the data suggests that the stereotype is true. What sort of mitigations or what sort of research is being done to uncode the bias?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I remember I posted something on our Facebook a while ago about like machines themselves are biased, like in terms of a lot of algorithms because they're fed by people, right? And like the people themselves are biased. And so, yeah, what can you do to fix it? I mean, be super aware of everything and be mindful as you write these algorithms and things. But yeah, like unless there's someone at the top that really is like understanding it, it's super hard because it can just reinforce those things. Yeah. All right, thank you.